All right, so this is just a brief kind of epilogue here to this lesson, but the Kennedy assassination is a major turning point in American history because it is the end of an era of optimism. It's an end of the era from 1945 to 63, where the consensus, by and large, of most people in America is optimism about the future and optimism about America's role in the world. So the idea is that America has the right ideals and that the American government can be trusted in the long run to promote those ideals. So you can think about this in terms of the Cold War policies that always portrayed in a kind of moral way of good versus evil, consistently in the period in Truman, Eisenhower, and Kennedy, and Americans really believing in that, there being a conservative consensus around that, right? Um, and there's that. There's a kind of widespread embrace of traditional family values, of the value that capitalistic endeavor can bring to an economy, and so on and so forth. So a conservative consensus in place in the context of the Cold War. In the context of the Civil Rights Movement, we could say there's a similar optimism here. Now, obviously, for Black Americans, they're fed up and they want things to change, right? But part of the reason for the resurgence and the determined renewal of the Civil Rights Movement in the late 40s and 50s is precisely because the Civil Rights Movement has a deep belief in the values of the American system and Constitution and the ideals that it represents of equality. And it believes that now is the time where they're going to force the American government to finally fulfill its promises to Black Americans. And there's optimism about that, right? So there's optimism about the expansion of the American dream globally, and optimism about the expansion of the American dream within the United States, okay? Well, the turning point really seems to be 1963. For the Black community, it's probably Birmingham that's the bigger turning point, because they see, all Black people in America see on television the young people being attacked by the police. And it's, for many of them, it just becomes increasingly impossible to embrace a method of nonviolence. You have to meet violence with violence. Many of them are going to say you have to practice self-defense here. And some of them are going to say the whole idea of integration is nonsense. Why would we want to integrate into this? Separation is the way forward. Okay? So that turning point for Black Americans is probably Birmingham. For white Americans, it's more Kennedy's death. Why? Okay, well, Kennedy is very popular as a president, but never so popular as after his death. And people are looking back on him as this young, alive, vibrant guy, the youngest president we'd ever had, who uses a very heroic rhetoric in speaking about foreign policy and speaking about civil rights and speaking, his great speeches. And he talks, of course, about the new frontier and America expanding the promise and, moving into space even and being a leader there and having excitement about that and optimism about that. All right. And they're looking at all of that and everything is cut off so abruptly, so unexpectedly. It's such a shock. It's such a trauma, right? And they're looking back and they're thinking, like, look at what we've lost. So there's this deep sense of loss following his death. And then, of course, you have the speculations surrounding the death and the beginnings of a kind of deep-seated distrust among both conservatives and left-wingers of the American government. And a beginning of a growing sense of, well, our government is hiding things for us. Our government is not serving our ideals in the best way. Now, all of this is going to just be intensified and magnified in the next 5 years. From 64 to 69, America is almost torn apart. Okay? You have, on the one hand, the intensification of racial tension and racial violence. On the other hand, you have, of course, the beginning of the war in Vietnam, when young men are going to be sent to Vietnam, and the widespread opposition and growing hostility to the war in Vietnam among the youth, and the growth of a really big protest movement, which is kind of centered around a distrust of the American government and a questioning of the values of the conservative consensus, especially traditional sexual morality. Okay, so there's going to be a challenging not only to there's not going to be a challenge to sort of the extent to which people trust their government, but the whole student protest movement, a lot of it is tied into also the sexual revolution, and thus a renunciation of the traditional values of family, to a large extent for many. Okay, and that's going to cause additional divisions. Okay, and intensification of strife among generations, and even within among young people themselves and older people themselves. Okay, so the whole country is going to change in the next 5 years. It's going to really be like torn apart, really. And there's going to be a sense that this idea of an American dream that could encompass and include everyone, that seems to have been lost by the end of the 1960s. So the dream of Kennedy for a bright future, the dream of Martin Luther King Jr. for integrated and harmonious relationships between black people and white people. A lot of people by the end of the 1960s are looking back and saying, well, that dream was lost, and maybe starting in 1963, they might say. All right, so there's going to be a real decline in optimism there. Now, the myth surrounding John F. Kennedy, a lot of it is created by Jackie Kennedy in the days after his death. She very carefully organizes and choreographs the funeral, which is televised live and millions of Americans watch it. It's very moving. She then also gives an interview to a reporter for Life magazine. And she's talking about Kennedy's youth, in which he's a sort of sickly kid, and he's reading King Arthur tales and the Knights of the Round Table and so forth. And she says more recently, like the last few months, he'd been really interested in this new musical of Camelot, and he would listen to it at night, recordings of it at night. And he loved this line about about Camelot, the mythical kingdom of King Arthur, and the musical said something like quote, don't let it be forgot that once there was a spot for one brief shining moment that was known as Camelot. And then she goes on and she's talking about, well, look, her husband's administration was this, she calls it a magic moment when you had these gallant men and these beautiful women, and these wonderful parties in the White House, and the artists and the musicians were welcomed in, and you had heroic deeds, and you had good versus evil, America versus the Soviets. And it was just this magic time in our history, she says. And she says that that's over. There will never be another Camelot, she says. And, it's this kind of very sentimental reflection on the part of a grieving widow, who is also interested in preserving and promoting her husband's memory. But it has a huge it lands really big with the American people. And it becomes kind of the image of JFK that she cultivates becomes the enduring one. Okay? And it's not just, him and the actual realities of his presidency, but it's what they represent, that optimism and that dream for America that many people lost faith in starting in 1960.